I looked at the climate change scenarios, which I thought were really interesting, as they related to the military. But I'm basically a conservationist and an anthropologist, and I went back and I looked at the history of climate change. And if we look at the archaeology, the times when human cultures underwent particularly violent periods in their history were times of rapid climate change. And if you think about why this would be, it's because when the climate change is rapid, what you're seeing is a change in the distribution of rainfall, especially. That's what has the impact on the relationship between different types of human cultures. So the one study that I can quote for you, hello Julia. I'm just setting IUCN policy here. I got here just in time.
Go ahead. I'd love to just sit and listen.
Interpreting.
So the one study that I wanted to share with you was a study of prehistoric warfare in the American Southwest. And archaeologists were looking at, some of you may know about the Anasazi, who were, well, there was changing patterns of rainfall. And there were 2 or 3 different cultures that lived in the region. And the distribution of these cultures depended on the productivity of the landscape. And that depended in turn on the distribution of rainfall. I don't want to go into all the details of this, but I'd be happy to provide it to you in due course. But the point is that what we're going to see with rapid climate change is distributions of rainfall that are going to influence agriculture. So the productivity of the land is going to depend, as it does now, on rainfall. And if rainfall patterns are less predictable, they lead to floods or droughts, the productivity of the land is going to change. And when different groups who have become accustomed to levels of productivity now have to face a different set of productivity, that's when conflict tends to occur. And that's what indeed happened in the American Southwest 1,000 years ago. It's not to say that any of this is inevitable. History doesn't tell us that we must go in a certain way, but it does tell us that this has happened in the past and that there may be lessons that we can learn from this as we're writing our scenarios. Thinking about the distribution of rainfall, the distribution of the productivity of landscapes for agriculture. And then if we also start thinking about the distribution of forests, and we relate this in turn to climate change, the most effective way to sequester carbon is through maintaining old-growth forest. And the old-growth forest prospers where there's heavy rainfall, tropical rainforests. So if we look at a place like Amazonia in Brazil, the government of Brazil is very protective of the forests of Amazonia. They run military exercises in Amazonia to protect their forests against potential invasions. This is their scenario. They're war games. They're afraid that the Americans are going to invade because they want to conserve the forests, which are we call them, everybody calls these the lungs of the earth. Many of us would say, well, that's ridiculous. But then, if you put yourself in the place of the Brazilians, and you read what the conservationists are saying about how important the lungs of the earth are to rainfall, to productivity of the oceans, and all these things, it becomes a little bit more understandable why they would want to make sure that there is a capacity to respond to a threat, a perceived threat to their forests. Now, there's another element that I wanted to put on the table, bringing us into something a little more realistic as it relates to biodiversity. And this is the conflict in Central Africa And what this has meant to one particular species in Lake Edward, the hippopotamus. And you might think, well, that isn't really terribly relevant to what we're talking about here. But the population reduced from about almost 10,000 hippos in the 1970s to less than 1,000 in 2005 because of poaching to feed the various militaries that were in conflict at that time. Okay, you might say, well, good, there was a nice source of meat. But if you think about the ecological implications of this, the hippos were putting about 100 million tons of, how shall I put this delicately? They start waving their tail and they spread their droppings. They're herbivores, and so it puts nutrients into the lake that supported a very productive fishery that 5,000 people depended upon. But with no hippos, there were no hippo droppings, and the population of hippos led to a great decline in the population of tilapia that was supporting the fishery. So the conflict that was taking place in Central Africa that affected the hippos also affected 5,000 people and a fishery. So looking at the ecological relationships between a conflict and a way of managing the conflict and what the ecological implications are can be very interesting. There were 97 rangers were killed in Virunga National Park, which is a World Heritage Site. And a place where many of the refugees from Rwanda were put after the genocide in Rwanda. And this led to a series of other problems, and some of the rebel militia threatened to kill the mountain gorillas if their demands were not met. So the gorillas threatened to kill the gorillas. The gorillas. It's a joke.
Malicious.
Okay, so to me the more amazing thing is that in Central Africa the mountain gorillas have actually made it, because some of the rebel groups have protected the mountain gorillas and allowed tourists to go up and visit them, and they would collect money from the tourists still visiting the mountain gorillas. So, conservation is not always something that is just in the interests of the government. It may be in the interests of combatants on both sides. And I could give you some other examples, but we don't have a whole lot of time. I also wanted to mention another element of this that IUCN has been working on, which is international peace parks, looking at protected areas on two sides of the border. And one very interesting example comes from your country, with your border with Peru, the Cordillera del Condor. And so the governments of Peru and Ecuador agreed to a binding arbitration that ended up establishing, as part of a binding border demarcation, a series of protected areas on both sides of the border, which also protected biodiversity and protected indigenous people, of the Jawaro-speaking people in that part of the upper Amazon. So that was a very good example of where governments had agreed to use conservation as a means of keeping peace. So if we then swing our optic around and look at the South China Sea, the South China Sea has it has rich deposits of proven deposits of gas and may have oil, but it's also claimed by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan, just to make things even more complicated, also has claims in there. What if we made that a peace park and got all those governments to sit down together and to decide among them how to distribute the benefits that come from harvesting the oil, and we'll talk about climate change later. But yeah, the fact is that they're in there right now exploiting the gas. But if they were able to do that, if we made an international peace park that was also conserving the biodiversity of the South China Sea, which is very important for fisheries, they support the fisheries in all of those countries, even as far away as Thailand and Malaysia. Indonesian fishermen go in there. So that might be a way of also demonstrating that conservation is a way of bringing governments that otherwise might be in conflict, bringing them together around a peaceful solution. I think the last point that I'd like to make is what many of us perceive as a changing role of the military. When there was a typhoon in Burma, Myanmar last year, the military was able to respond very quickly because they were there. So the Americans had ships, the Indians had ships. The military was a quick response mechanism to a humanitarian crisis of an extreme climatic event. One of the things that many scenarios project with climate change is an increase in extreme climatic events. Well, who's going to respond to these extreme climatic events that become disasters when they involve human populations? When we see more typhoons that cause these kinds of problems, the military are the ones who are there. Are they trained to do this? Well, maybe not normally, but perhaps this is something that they need to start training on. And I think that if you right now look at the militaries around the world, and if you look at military bases, you'll find that many of them have senior officers who are assigned responsibility for managing the environmental integrity of the base. And that's not just pollution, that's also things like forest conservation. So in Thailand, the country where I lived for 7 years, yeah, we could. But so if you want to look at for monkeys, it's the military bases where you're much more likely to see them because hunting is controlled. So in a way, these are protected areas, protected for biodiversity. And maybe not every country, but in many countries around the world. India also has a military that is very interested in conservation, and the Thai army is being used to plant trees. When I was working in Indochina in the late 60s during the Vietnam War, I was working for the Mekong Committee. And the principle there was to develop the water resources potential of the Mekong River to provide benefits to the people who were living in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the northeastern part of Thailand. And the explicit objective was development to promote peace. That with development, there would be less of a motivation to have the kinds of conflict that we were seeing. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, but a lot of the things that we developed back in the late 60s and the early 70s are now being implemented by Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The ideas that were developed back at that time have now been proven to be valid and useful. And so we're seeing a resurgence of development in this part of the world that has been driven at least partly because of some of the initiatives that were developed during a time of war. So, war is an extreme human event. I talked about extreme natural events. It's an extreme human event. It's an event or a process where things can change. And we see that coming out of we heard about World War II, which Wouter was talking about. Things changed profoundly because of those wars. And perhaps we're going to see things changing out of the various wars that are going on now. If we can somehow promote the conservation of biodiversity, maintaining functioning ecosystems, then we're more likely to be able to come out of those conflicts in a more productive way. And so from my perspective, I've been working on this for, since the late 60s, trying to conserve biodiversity as a way of promoting development in a post-conflict situation in that part of the world and at that time. And I think that this is a very valid line for IUCN to take, that the more we're able to conserve biodiversity, the more we're able to maintain options, the more we're able to give people the capacity to adapt to changing conditions, the better off the world is going to be and the less conflict we're going to have in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.